They buried Henry Keene just as the first light stretched over Dry Ridge, when the frost still clung to the cedar fence rails, and the preacher's voice trembled more from cold than grief. Nora Keene didn't cry, not then, not even as the last shovelful of dirt hit the wooden box. Her son, Eli, just 6 years old, clutched a carved wooden pony in his left hand and her coat in the other, both held so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Henry had been sheriff of Moss Creek for barely a year before the bullet came. Fast, cheap, and from a man who wore no name, just a scar, and the same gray coat he'd been seen in before 2 other towns turned red. Folks said Henry shouldn't have stood in the outlaw's way. Nora hadn't said a word since. Now, as the townsfolk cleared out, some nodding awkward condolences, some not even making eye contact, Nora stayed behind. She knelt down, smoothed the frozen dirt over the grave, and placed Henry's badge beside the stone. It didn't gleam anymore. A storm had rolled in the night he died, and Nora still hadn't scrubbed the mud from it. Eli sat cross-legged beside her, the carved pony in his lap. "Will Papa come back like in stories?" he asked, voice quiet. Nora didn't answer. She touched his head gently, but her eyes were fixed on the trees beyond the cemetery. Dense pines, silent as judgment. Sheriff Boyd had offered her a train ticket east, said she'd be safer with family. But Nora had no one left east, and she had Henry's blood under her fingernails. She was staying. That night, the wind howled down the hills like it remembered something, and in the morning, Nora returned to the grave to find something strange. Someone had been there, fresh boot prints in the snow crust, large and pointed at the toes like no one in town wore. And lying at the foot of the grave, tucked into the snow like it had been carefully placed, was a second wooden toy, an almost identical pony, carved from darker wood, the details sharper, the craftsmanship unfamiliar. Nora picked it up slowly. Eli's breath caught behind her. "Mama," he whispered, "that's not mine." She turned the toy in her hand. On its underside, burned in with a hot blade, was a single word: forgive. And suddenly, the silence wasn't so empty anymore. By noon the next day, word had spread. Not about the toy, Nora hadn't told a soul, but about the tracks. Preacher Elms mentioned them at the general store, and by dusk, half the town had theories. "Maybe the outlaw came back," someone muttered near the feed barrels, "to mock the grave." "Or maybe she carved it herself," another whispered. "She ain't right since the shootin'." But Nora knew better. The carving had weight, the detail in the mane, the way the word forgive was branded. She couldn't have made that. Someone had been there. Someone with a reason. That night, Nora tucked Eli into bed early and sat by the oil lamp long after the wick burned low, the second pony resting on the table between them like a question no one had asked out loud. Her mind wandered backward, to the man Henry once told her about, in a low, disgusted tone over dinner. "Used to ride with a crew out near Silver Hollow," Henry had said. "Killed a store owner in front of his wife, never even flinched. Some say he's got Apache blood. Others say he's just got no soul." She remembered asking, "Then why hasn't anyone caught him?" And Henry's eyes had darkened. "Because he disappears like smoke, and he never looks back." She wondered if that was the man who'd returned. 2 days passed. Then 3. And on the 4th morning, another gift appeared. This time it was a worn leather coin pouch laid gently beside the grave. Inside were 2 old buffalo nickels and a small note folded like a prayer. It said, "He saved my life once. I owed him, and I owe you too." No name, no tracks this time, just the message. Nora took the pouch home, hands trembling. She didn't tell Eli. That night she barely slept. At dawn, she walked back to the cemetery, this time waiting in the copse of trees beyond the fence, breath quiet, heart tight. Hours passed. Cold gnawed at her knees. But just before the sky turned pale, she saw him. A man in a long coat, moving like he belonged to the shadows. He didn't go to the grave this time, just stood at a distance, hat in hand, face half covered in the fog. Nora couldn't see his expression, but she felt something strange in her chest, something between fear and recognition. And when he turned to leave, she whispered, "Why are you coming back?" The wind carried her words nowhere, but the man paused just for a second and tipped his hat to the empty headstone before vanishing into the trees. Nora didn't tell anyone what she'd seen. Not the sheriff, not the preacher, and certainly not the women who came by with half-hearted condolences wrapped in stale bread. But inside her, something had shifted. The man, whoever he was, hadn't come to gloat. There'd been reverence in the way he stood, a quiet kind of grief. The next day, Nora walked Eli past the schoolhouse, and as she tied his scarf, he looked up and asked, "Mama, did Papa ever save someone bad?" The question knocked the breath from her chest. "Why?" she asked. Eli shrugged, but his hand clutched the toy pony tighter. "I think the man who made this, maybe he knew Papa?" Nora didn't answer. She watched her son walk into the classroom, the teacher greeting him with that cautious, pitying smile they all wore around her now. She didn't correct her son's guess, because deep down, she felt it too. That night, Nora boiled coffee late, placed the second pony on the table, and stared at it until her eyes burned. She thought about what it meant to forgive a man who'd taken your future. Then she thought about the word burned beneath the pony's belly. Forgive. And wondered whose forgiveness was being asked for. The following morning, Sheriff Boyd came knocking. He was a tall man, hands always on his belt like he was born with authority. "I need to ask you something," he said, hat in hand. "You seen anything odd out by Henry's grave?" Nora stared at him, her face unreadable. "Why?" He shifted. "There were tracks, big ones, point north, and Cora from the inn swears she saw a man near the stables 2 nights ago, just standing still." Nora said nothing. Boyd leaned in. "If it's who I think it is, you're in danger." But Nora surprised them both. "Maybe not," she said. "Maybe he's in danger now." The sheriff blinked. "You think this is some sort of peace offering?" "I don't know what it is, but Henry wouldn't want you chasing ghosts. He'd want you watching the living." Boyd studied her for a long moment, then tipped his hat and left. That evening, Nora returned to the grave one more time. She didn't bring flowers, just herself, and this time a man stepped out from behind the sycamore near the edge of the fence. His coat was frayed, his boots cracked. A scar sliced down his left temple like a lightning bolt, stopping just short of his eye. He didn't smile, didn't speak, but he held out something small. A third toy. This one was a horse and rider, carved with 2 figures, a father and son. Nora's fingers trembled as she reached for the carved toy, but the man didn't release it right away. For a heartbeat, their hands touched, his skin rough, hers cold from the wind. Then he let go and stepped back, eyes never leaving hers. "He ever mention me?" the man asked, voice like gravel over water. Nora shook her head. "No name, just someone with no soul." The outlaw gave a faint, bitter smile. "Sounds about right." He looked down at the grave, his jaw tight. "Your husband saved my life in El Paso. I was running, cut bad, bleeding out in a barn. He found me, could have turned me in. Should have. But he didn't." Nora didn't speak, letting the silence stretch between them like barbed wire. Finally he added, He just gave me his flask, stitched the wound, said, "Don't make me regret this." I never saw him again, until I read the name on that stone. Nora glanced at the toy, now resting at the grave's base. "You've been coming here," she said quietly. "Leaving things." He nodded. I owed him. I still do. Eli's voice broke the moment. "Mama?" He stood a few feet behind her, sleepy-eyed and barefoot in the frost. Nora's heart twisted. She hadn't heard him leave the cabin. The outlaw tensed, hand moving near his coat, but Nora raised a palm. "It's all right." Eli looked at the stranger with curious eyes. "Are you the man who brought the other pony?" The outlaw hesitated. Then slowly he knelt so he was eye level with the boy. "I am." "Did you know my papa?" "I did." "Did he smile much?" Eli asked softly. The outlaw blinked hard, as if something heavy had cracked inside him. "Not often. But when he talked about you and your mama, he looked like he wanted to." Eli nodded, satisfied with the answer, and walked to the grave. He placed his original pony beside the new one. 2 toys now, one lighter, one dark, standing side by side in the dirt like silent sentinels. Nora watched the outlaw rise again. "What's your name?" she asked. "Don't matter," he muttered. "I'm not here to stay." "You already have," she said quietly. "Whether you meant to or not." For the first time, his eyes softened. He looked at her. Not like an outlaw, not like a ghost, but like a man trying to understand forgiveness carved in wood. Then he tipped his hat, turned, and began to walk toward the tree line once more. But this time, Nora called after him. "You owe Henry. Then stay long enough to help raise the boy he left behind." He stopped mid-step, shoulders rigid, the mist curling around his boots like hesitation made visible. For a full minute, the outlaw didn't turn, didn't move, then finally faced her again. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, voice low. "I don't fix fences, I don't tell bedtime stories, and I don't know how to be around something that still believes in good." Nora's expression didn't flinch. "Neither do I, not since they put Henry in the ground." Her words struck like iron on cold stone, and something in his face shifted. Less pride now, more ache. He took a few slow steps back toward the grave, then glanced at Eli, who had sat quietly, legs tucked beneath him, watching both adults as if memorizing a scene he'd replay forever. "He's got his father's stare," the outlaw muttered. "Steady, makes a man feel seen." Eli looked up. "Mama says we don't need more men with guns. We need men with hands that stay." The outlaw froze. He looked at his own hands, fingers calloused, one knuckle twisted from an old break. They'd pulled triggers, held knives, stolen food and worse, but they'd also carved toys in the dark, smoothed splinters so a child wouldn't bleed. He sighed. "If I stay," he said finally, "you'll have questions. Folks will talk, and some won't stop at talk." Nora stepped forward. "Let them. I'm not scared of whispers, not after burying the only man who ever looked at me without pity." That caught him. She saw it in the way he blinked. Quick, defensive. "You think I'm some kind of replacement?" he asked. "No," she replied, soft but steady. "I think you're unfinished." He said nothing for a while. Then, without another word, he sat down on the edge of the porch, pulled a carving knife from his belt, and took out a fresh block of wood. "Horse?" Eli asked, hope flickering in his voice. The outlaw nodded. "This one'll have a saddle." Inside, Nora leaned against the doorframe and finally let herself breathe. There was no ceremony in what had just happened. No deal. No vows. Just a man too broken to run anymore and a boy who'd never learned to stop hoping. Outside, the outlaw worked silently, hands moving with the same care that once stitched a dying sheriff back together. And as dawn rose higher, it wasn't guilt or debt keeping him there. It was something quieter. Not forgiveness, not yet. But maybe the start of it. By the time noon sun crested the pines, the outlaw had nearly finished the carving. Eli sat beside him, knees pulled up to his chest, watching every stroke of the blade like it was magic. Nora stayed close but out of view, sweeping the porch or pretending to fold linens just so she could keep glancing toward them. The new horse had detail. Real detail. A saddle with stirrups, reins that curled like wind-blown rope, and tiny notches on the hooves, as if they'd galloped through something hard. "How do you know how to make 'em like that?" Eli finally asked. The outlaw shrugged. "Used to have a brother who loved horses. I'd carve him to keep him from crying when Pa got angry." He didn't elaborate. Eli didn't ask more. But Nora caught that pause, the way his hand slowed for just a second before he pressed on. The townsfolk, of course, noticed. Mrs. Tillman saw the man near the general store that afternoon and dropped her sack of flour. Sheriff Boyd rode past once, twice, maybe 3 times more than usual, though he never stopped. No one approached Nora, but the glances said enough. At church the next morning, half the pews stayed empty. Eli asked why, and she only said, "Sometimes people leave when they're scared of what's right." The outlaw didn't go inside, but he stood by the hitching post, arms crossed, eyes low. 1 or 2 children stared curiously. No one else dared speak to him. That evening, after supper, Nora brought him coffee in a chipped enamel mug. He took it with a nod. "You ever think of leaving?" he asked. She looked out toward the graveyard. "Only every day. But then Eli laughs, or the wind carries Henry's voice across the porch, and I remember what staying means." He took a long sip and murmured, "Staying's the hardest part." She smiled faintly. "That's how I know it's worth something." Later that night, a knock came at the door. Nora opened it with a shotgun in one hand and calm eyes. It was Preacher Elms, gray-haired, breathless. "Sheriff Boyd's missing," he said. "Rode out yesterday. Never came back. Folks think, maybe your guest knows something." Nora didn't look back towards the porch, where the outlaw sat in shadow. "He hasn't left this house," she said, "and he doesn't lie." But as the door closed behind the preacher, she turned to see the outlaw already rising, jaw tight, hand brushing near his belt. Not for a weapon, but for the knife he used to carve. "I know where Boyd went," he said, voice low, "and if I don't go after him, he won't come back." Nora stood frozen, the warmth of the room fading as if the outlaw's words had blown the wind in with them. "How do you know where he went?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Because I told him to meet me there, weeks ago, before I knew who Henry Keene really was. Before I knew you." He buckled his coat, eyes scanning the edge of the woods beyond the barn. "There's a place south of here called Widow's Gulch. Used to be a hideout for men like me. There's someone there Boyd thought he could take down alone, someone worse than I ever was." Eli appeared at the doorway, holding the new carved horse. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice small. The outlaw knelt down, steadying the boy's gaze. "Just for a bit. Gotta make sure the man who wears your papa's star gets home safe." Eli looked down at the figure in his hands. "Will you come back?" The man paused, then reached into his coat and pulled out something Nora hadn't seen before. A bullet, old and dented on a leather string. He looped it over Eli's neck. "If I don't," he said, "this means you make your own story now." Before Nora could speak, he was out the door, already mounting the roan mare tied behind the barn. The hooves cut through frost and mud like a warning shot. Nora watched from the porch, arms wrapped tight across her chest. She didn't stop him. She didn't beg him to stay. But her fingers curled around the second toy pony, as if anchoring herself to a truth no one else had seen. The ride to Widow's Gulch was cruel, wind like razors, ravines split like traps across the land. He rode hard, no rest, eyes always forward. When he reached the gulch, the tracks told him what he feared. Boyd's horse panicked, blood on the saddle horn, boot prints too small to be his. A second rider had been here, or maybe more. He dismounted and drew his knife, not his gun, and slid down the ridge, every instinct on edge. Voices echoed off stone. A campfire burned low near the gulch's edge, smoke clinging to the shadows, and tied to a tree, battered but alive, was Sheriff Boyd. His lip was split, his eye near swollen shut. One of the men standing over him looked up, his grin widening. "Ain't this something?" he said. "Ghost of the West himself, come crawling back." The outlaw stepped into the firelight. "Not crawling," he said softly, "coming to collect." The fire crackled between them like a fuse waiting to catch. The outlaw stood still, his knife low and loose in his grip. Across the clearing, the three men circling Sheriff Boyd didn't flinch, but they didn't rush either. They recognized him. One stepped forward, short and wide, a scar running from his earlobe to the corner of his mouth. "You always did love a lost cause," he sneered. "Sheriffs, widows, kids. Funny how death follows you around." The outlaw didn't answer. His eyes locked on Boyd, whose head hung low but twitched at the sound of his voice. "You left this life," the scarred man continued. "Tried to carve your sins away like bark from bad wood. But you're still one of us. You just forgot how to bleed." The outlaw moved first. Not a charge, just a blur of practiced motion, silent and exact. His knife found the nearest throat before a pistol ever cleared leather. One man down. The next lunged and caught him across the ribs, but he spun with it, turned pain into momentum, and dropped the second man to the dirt. The scarred one backed away, drawing his gun. "You should have stayed gone," he yelled, pulling the trigger. The outlaw's shoulder jerked back, but he kept moving, knife in hand, until it slammed into the man's gut with a grunt. They both went down in a heap. The fire hissed as blood spat into the dust. For a second there was nothing but heavy breathing and the wind. Then the outlaw rolled off, gripping his side, and dragged himself toward Boyd. "You all right?" he rasped. Boyd opened one eye. "Define all right." They both gave a weak laugh. Back at the cabin, the wind had picked up. Nora sat by the window, watching shadows crawl across the porch. Eli hadn't asked questions, just held the wooden horse and waited. Nora had spent most of her life waiting, but this time felt different. She wasn't waiting for loss. She was waiting for proof that something broken could still return. At dawn, hooves thundered down the trail. Nora burst from the door, shotgun in hand, heart in her throat, until she saw the shape on the saddle. Sheriff Boyd slumped forward, bruised but alive. And behind him, leading the roan by its reins with one arm wrapped tight across his bleeding ribs, was the outlaw. Nora ran to meet them. She didn't speak, just helped him down and guided him to the porch. "Thought I'd taught you to sit still," she said, trying to smile. He winced, lowering himself to the step. "Still don't listen well." Then, softer. "But I'm trying." For 3 days, the outlaw barely moved. Nora changed the bandages twice a day, her hands firm but gentle, and Eli brought water without being asked, always setting it beside the carved toys lined up on the windowsill. Sheriff Boyd had been taken to town by wagon once he could sit upright, vowing not to speak of what truly happened in Widow's Gulch, only that the outlaw had saved his life. "You owe him nothing," Nora had told Boyd. But he shook his head. "We both do." The outlaw slept most of the time, sweat beading on his brow, pain knotting across his side, but when he finally opened his eyes on the 4th morning, he found Eli asleep on the floor beside him, and Nora dozing in the chair, arms crossed over her chest. The cabin smelled of coffee and cedar, not blood. It smelled like something he hadn't known in years. Safety. That night, he sat on the porch with Nora, the sky wide with stars. She handed him a cup and asked, "Why never tell us your name?" He hesitated, then answered softly, "Because the last person who used it died with the man I used to be." He looked down at his hands. "But if you want one, pick one. Just don't make it biblical." Nora considered. "How about Whit?" He smiled, actually smiled. "Huh. Short, quiet, sounds like someone who leaves splinters on the table. I'll take it." Inside, Eli was building a fence with little sticks and the ponies, lining up the horses like they were soldiers. "Mama," he called, "does Whit know how to fish?" Nora raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" Whit leaned back against the post, watching the stars. "I know how to wait real quiet by a stream, if that counts." Nora laughed, the sound catching her off guard. It had been too long since she'd laughed without flinching. "Close enough," she said. Later, as she swept near Henry's old rifle rack, Nora found the outlaw's carving knife tucked between the slats, wrapped in cloth, clean and sharp. With it, a note in a careful, unfamiliar scrawl. Not leaving. Just resting. For the first time in weeks, she slept with both doors unlocked. The next morning, townsfolk who had once crossed the street to avoid them now nodded stiffly. A few even said hello. When Eli ran into the store carrying one of Whit's horses, Mrs. Tillman smiled and said, "That's fine work." But Nora just smiled and whispered under her breath, "You haven't seen anything yet." Spring came late that year, creeping in with cautious warmth and winds that carried more memory than scent. The fields behind Nora's cabin finally thawed, and Eli started building things again. Real things this time. A chicken coop, a gate latch, and a place beneath the willow tree where he and Whit would sit in the evenings and talk about everything except the past. Whit never spoke about the trail he rode before Moss Creek. He didn't have to. His silence had weight, but it no longer felt like hiding. It felt like healing. He'd stopped sleeping on the edge of the bedroll, stopped watching the door, stopped flinching every time a horse rode past. The knife stayed in the drawer now, unless Eli asked for another pony. One morning, while Nora tended the herb bed, a rider approached from the east. A traveler just passing through. He asked if she knew where he could find Sheriff Boyd, said he heard the lawman in these parts had been saved by a ghost. Nora didn't blink. "The sheriff's in town," she said, "but the ghost's already been claimed." Later that week, Nora stood beside Henry's grave with Eli and Whit on either side. She held a small tin box in her hand. Inside it, Henry's badge, the first wooden pony, and the bullet necklace Eli had worn through winter. She placed it in the earth, soft now from the melt, and whispered, "You gave us everything. We just had to learn how to carry it." Eli reached for Whit's hand. "Papa would have liked you," he said quietly. Whit's throat tightened. He knelt and brushed snowmelt from the headstone. "I didn't come here to take his place," he murmured. "Then don't," Nora said. "Just stand in the space he left behind. That's enough." That night, by the fire, Eli curled into Whit's side with a new carving in hand. A bear this time, fierce but soft-eyed. "You ever been to Red Hollow?" he asked suddenly. Whit looked down. "Once. Long time ago." Eli grinned. "Let's go there someday. See if they've got bears for real." Whit met Nora's gaze across the room. She didn't speak, just nodded once, slow and sure. It wasn't permission. It was partnership. Outside, the porch creaked with wind. The sky above Moss Creek stretched wide and open, not with grief this time, but with promise. and in the dust below the window, Nora had etched one word with the toe of her boot, just deep enough to remain when the rain came. Ours. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on native Western tales. If you had seen her there, would you have stepped in too? Tell us in the comments.